Today is April 15th, 2026, and as many of you know, we are in the middle of the 2-week ceasefire that began last Tuesday. It was brokered by Pakistan between the US and Israel and Iran, temporarily putting on hold hostilities that began February 28th, 2026 between the US and Israel and Iran. We had our first set of negotiations on this past Saturday between the US and Iran. They subsequently broke down. They were about 21 hours. And there's a blockade now imposed by the US on the waterway, the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the US and Iran continue to exchange messages about a potential deal to end the war. They're talking through back channels. They have been talking through back channels even while hostilities were still going on. So despite the failure this weekend with the first round of negotiations, talks are continuing, and as we're about to get into, there will likely be further talks scheduled. Now, if you remember in the previous video that I had shot on this issue, I said that it's very likely that after the first round of negotiations began this past weekend, that the negotiations would be continuing, likely for quite some time. I said that the idea of hostilities starting back to the extent that they were taking place before the negotiations started, before the ceasefire started, were unlikely. I think that what we're seeing develop right now is progress towards further talks, both high-level and low-level technical talks, which would take some time. It doesn't seem that either side, Iran or the US, are particularly interested right now in starting any kind of kinetic action again, especially when you consider the efforts behind the scenes from countries like Oman, Pakistan, even China and Russia to keep the US and Iran at the table talking. So the marathon negotiations that took place in Islamabad, Pakistan on Saturday, these were the highest level talks thus far in the war between Washington and Tehran. And they ended with US President J.D. Vance allegedly walking out of the meetings, blaming Iran for being intransigent, for their unwillingness to commit to not developing nuclear weapons, more specifically, the enrichment issue. The other issue, as we'll get into, is, of course, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. As you know, after the ceasefire was initiated, Iran's military, the IRGC, retained control over the straits, and they were charging tolls for selective shipping going through the strait. Now, on Saturday, these talks on the U.S. side were headed off by J.D. Vance, and he had Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner supporting. I actually would say that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff were there to represent the more hawkish line within Trump's administration and the Israeli side. As many of you know, after the ceasefire was agreed upon by the US and Iran, Israel continued to fight Lebanon. And according to Pakistan and Iran, Lebanon was part of the ceasefire package. In other words, there would be a ceasefire, and that would include Israel's continued offensive in southern Lebanon. And Israel continued to attack. They carried out a horrendous strike on Beirut the day after the ceasefire was announced. And so on the Iranian side of the negotiations were the Speaker of the Parliament, Mohammad Ghalibaf, the Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, the Central Bank Ambassador, Al-Banasser Hemati, I'm butchering some of these names, and Al-Bagheri Khani, the chief nuclear negotiator. Now, this was a high-level team produced by the Iranian side, so it appears that they were very serious about these talks. They had the full authority of the Iranian government to make a deal. This doesn't seem to be the posture that the U.S. had going into the negotiations. It's been alleged that J.D. Vance had to call back to Washington and speak directly to Trump at least 21 times during the negotiation. So he apparently didn't have the full authority of the U.S. to make a final deal outside of Iran basically accepting all of the accepting the ultimatums that the U.S. was presenting. So you have a very similar circumstance on Saturday that you had before the war even started, except J.D. Vance wasn't part of the negotiating team. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were in Iran. They were talking for a couple of weeks, presenting Iran with these ultimatums. Very little space, but there's very little agreement between them. And so is this the question that we have to ask now is, are we heading down the same path? And as I've said before, looking at all of these developments, these slow rolling developments, it doesn't look like we're going to be seeing hostilities starting back anytime soon, but it's up in the air. There's a lot of unpredictability. So all we can do is just observe at this point. The two diplomats, the diplomats involved in these discussions were in active talks and ongoing through mediators to extend the ceasefire and secure a more permanent deal. And again, everything right now is pointing towards the talks continuing and an extension to the ceasefire. Trump has even alluded to this in some interviews that he's done since the negotiations took place on Saturday. Now, people briefed on the discussion said intermediaries were seeking to convince the parties to hold low-level technical talks to hammer out disagreements over issues such as the reopening of the Strait and Iran's nuclear program. And if we remember during last year's negotiations, these technical talks were ongoing at a lower level, and there were many hangups, particularly on the percentage by which, if Iran continued to enrich nuclear material, if they continued their nuclear enrichment program, one example that was a point of contention was to what percentage would they be able to enrich. Another is, what were they going to do with the already enriched uranium that they had? It was enriched up to 60%. Would they remove it from the country and move it to a country like Russia, or would the U.S. take it over? These were many of the contentious points from last year's negotiations and from earlier this year. And so what the mediators are trying to do right now is bring the parties back to the table just to basically pick up on these talks. So securing an agreement on Iran's nuclear program is, of course, one of the key points of contention, as well as convincing Tehran to remove their hold over the Strait of Hormuz. And that's going to be an issue because one of the demands from Iran's 10-point list that they presented to the Trump administration, that Trump allegedly threw in the trash, was that they would retain control over the strait and charge tolls so they can rebuild after all the destruction that's taken place over the past month. They also want reparations from the U.S., and it's very likely that that's not going to happen. So at the very minimum, you might think that the U.S. would be willing to work with Iran on Iran retaining some kind of control over the strait, or sharing control over the strait with the U.S., which is an idea that Trump even floated last week, a joint venture where Iran and the U.S. manage the strait. And I would say that one of the reasons that Iran is saying now one of the reasons that the idea of reparations are even in their 10-point plan, Iran's 10-point plan, is because they probably know they're not going to get it. But it would be advantageous if they pulled away from the idea of reparations and said, well, okay, well, if we don't get the reparations, or if we can't immediately have our assets unfrozen or immediately have sanctions removed, then we can at least make money from the strait. And that doesn't seem, as I just stated, that the administration would have that much of an issue with it, as long as they weren't solely the ones reaping a benefit off of charging a toll from the Straits. Even Oman, it's been rumored, has been discussing with Iran how to share control of the Strait. So it's likely that this status quo that we're seeing right now isn't going to change too much as the negotiations go on. And I don't think that the administration is adamant on Iran, the IRGC, releasing their control over the Strait completely. So after the Saturday talks, President Trump instructed the U.S. Navy to mount a blockade to the Strait to prevent ships from moving in and out of Iranian ports to intensify, to create some leverage. And there's been reporting that certain ships are still traversing the Strait. It's difficult to see how Trump would really meaningfully implement this blockade, because there was already very little shipping coming out of the Strait. And it seems like imposing a blockade on a blockade is counterintuitive, and it would just basically create a lot more disruptions within the overall world economy. Because at least at the minimum, last week before the blockade was in place, Iran was letting certain ships through, even if it wasn't, even if there weren't many ships. We're talking maybe 4 or 5 ships per day. But that eased the markets just a little bit when they were doing that. So now with there just being a complete blockade, we've seen oil, for example, shoot back up above $100 a barrel, which all of us have seen, and we're seeing the pain at the pump continue. So he's trying to regain some leverage by doing this. And we're just going to go through a few updates that have taken place since the Saturday negotiations. And this is from the 14th. This is from yesterday. Bloomberg says Tuesday in a fresh report that Iran is considering a short-term pause to shipments through the Strait of Hormuz to avoid testing a U.S. blockade and scuppering the fresh round of talks. And I think that we're going to see a lot of signaling like this from both sides, because even if the U.S. is coming with ultimatums to these negotiations, I think that that the administration still, to some extent, wants to see a deal that doesn't look completely like an ultimatum. And even Iran, I think, is showing a little bit more flexibility, given some actions that they've been taking that we're going to get into. It doesn't mean, again, that everything is rosy and that we're just going to have endless negotiations. I'm not saying that, but talks are ongoing, and I think that given, like we said earlier, the effort by outside third-party countries to keep the parties at the table, the negotiations will likely continue. And, we have to remember that just because you might see this blockade or other actions that the administration might take that are hostile, or Iran might take that are hostile in the middle of these talks, it doesn't necessarily mean that that the entire the negotiations are just going to be thrown by the wayside and the war is going to start back the way it was. And I think that's the point I've made in the previous video. Yes, you're going to see hostile moves. Both sides are trying to create leverage and maneuver and get a better deal, get more out of each other. And this is all obvious. And there's going to be brinksmanship. There's going to be hostile moves. But are we going to see hostilities resume like that? Probably not. Even when you're looking at reporting from today that we're going to jump into in a minute, of thousands more troops headed to the Middle East. And on top of the roughly 10,000 that Trump has deployed over the past month, special forces, etc., when we were thinking that he was looking to force the Strait open by putting boots on the ground in Iran. It's important, I think, to keep all these things in perspective. We don't even know what the number of troops now that Trump is moving over there. Again, this could be just more posturing to keep Iran not only at the table, but to soften up their position. All of this is pretty obvious. So Iran signaled on Monday it would halt uranium enrichment for up to 5 years. And the Trump administration, and this was during the talks on Saturday. Now, Trump and his team, they rejected the 5 years, according to 2 Iranian officials and a U.S. official that spoke to the Times. Weeks before the war began in February, the U.S. had pushed for a 10-year moratorium on enriched uranium, and a day before the strikes began, according to Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi, the negotiations made significant progress, with Iran agreeing to give up its stockpile. Now, this is according to these officials. Could be true, might not be. But it seems like the idea of a small moratorium has been in the works for nuclear enrichment, has been in the talks for quite some time. Now the U.S. position since Saturday is that they want a 20-year moratorium on enrichment. Now, how this is going to work is anyone's guess, because again, you're not going to have Trump in office in about 2 years. J.D. Vance is not going to win the presidential election, and so when you have a different administration in place, they may return to the table. You have a 20-year moratorium. The Iranians may agree to it, and further down the road, when potentially we would assume that they'd get some kind of sanctions relief, assets would be unfrozen. They may want to renegotiate some of this stuff, or they may just stop complying with the enrichment aspect of it, because you have to think they have all the capabilities of doing it. The only thing that would keep them locked into a 20-year span of not enriching would be if there was some kind of deterrent, I would say, within Iran itself that would prevent them from doing it. You'd have to have these constant inspections. You'd likely have to continue to have military assets stationed where they are right now in the Middle East, just to keep the pressure up on Iran. And who knows what will happen with another administration taking over? Would they be able to continue implementing these deterrents, or would they be more malleable and go back to the negotiating table with Iran and maybe work something else out? So these a 20-year suspension, a 10-year suspension doesn't really mean much, but it's a discussion that's being had nonetheless. U.S. and Iranian negotiating teams plan to return to Pakistan later this week to resume talks aimed at ending the Gulf War. And this is according to Pakistani and Iranian officials. And this was yesterday cited from Reuters. Other reports say the talks could be hosted in another venue. The Wall Street Journal reported Monday evening that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is urging the Trump administration to reverse its newly implemented blockade of Iranian-linked shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, on the immediate fears that Iranian escalation could halt Red Sea traffic. And this is interesting because Saudi Arabia was one of the cheerleaders in the Middle East for Iran actually getting into these hostilities. You have Israel on the one side that basically dragged us into this war, and Saudi Arabia, right next to Israel, is also doing the cheerleading. And now that negotiations have started and the strait is completely blockaded, not only by Iran, but by the U.S., the Saudis are starting to see the result of their idiocy in urging the U.S. to engage in hostilities with Iran. And they're afraid of Red Sea traffic because the Houthis in Yemen have threatened to close the strait adjacent to Yemen. And so you see this kind of activity taking place. It's starting to choke certain countries in the Middle East. You have the Saudis, the Emiratis. They're starting to choke on their own mistake that they made, and that's helping to goad the U.S. into this war, knowing that the closure of the strait was a distinct possibility. Now, the head of Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, said on Tuesday that the organization's responsibility for operations in Iran will be complete only when the regime is changed. And so once more, we see that regime change, of course, was always the objective from day one, from the U.S. and Iran. From the U.S. and Israel's side. And you have to ask yourself, if there was a final deal made, how supportive Israel would be when the head of their intelligence agency is basically saying, of their their top intelligence agency is basically saying, well, look, we'll decide when hostilities are over. And Netanyahu said as recently as yesterday that J.D. Vance was on the phone with him as well during these negotiations, and after the negotiations taking place, updating the Prime Minister of Israel on what's going on. And so it tells you that perhaps there is some sentiment within Trump's administration that they want to stay at the negotiating table and talk, and maybe even come down on some of their demands. But with this kind of language, we can only assume that Mossad is also speaking for the Knesset and the hawks in Israel that want to see hostilities continue, not only between the U.S. and Iran, but also they want to basically give the Gaza treatment to Lebanon. And I wouldn't be surprised, obviously, if negotiations actually went well, as if they continued and went well, and Israel once more is the spoiler in all of this. And then once more, we'll see that the Saudi countries, or the Arab countries that were behind the war, once behind the war, miscalculated. Because again, their economies are going to continue to hurt as long as the Strait is closed. So the Washington Post is out with a new report of more troops, as we mentioned earlier, being sent to the theater. The Pentagon is sending thousands of additional troops into the Middle East in the coming days as the Trump administration attempts to pressure Iran into a deal that could end the weeks-long conflict. And as I mentioned earlier, we didn't get a number. I haven't seen a number in the information that I've been reading of the amount of troops that are going over there. But again, this is just building up leverage and the administration is trying to set themselves in a better position for when they return to the negotiating table. Now, according to Haaretz, the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports and renewed Iranian threats have imperiled the week-old agreement. But regional officials say today, that they're making progress, telling the Associated Press that the U.S. and Iran had given an in-principle agreement to extend negotiations and attempt to allow diplomacy to work. And this is a good sign. This is basically what we were thinking was going to happen anyways. And before the 2-week ceasefire expires on April 22nd, mediators are pushing for a compromise on 3 main sticking points that derailed the talks of the last weekend. We went over the first 2, which is the nuclear program in Hormuz, and then, of course, compensation for wartime damages. And this is according to regional officials that are involved in the mediation efforts. And we see that the 1-week ceasefire in Lebanon is being discussed presently. Yesterday in Washington, officials from Israel, negotiators from Israel and Lebanon met, and they're working on a ceasefire. It's supposed to be coming into effect today. And this is according to Iranian officials and also Hezbollah-officiated channels within Lebanon, which is interesting because I actually wasn't aware that officials from Hezbollah itself were directly involved in these negotiations. But Hezbollah has got connections within Lebanon's government and political ecosystem, so it isn't too far-fetched if a deal is reached for a ceasefire. And this is going to be another point of leverage for Iran, because Iran will be holding Washington's feet to the fire to ensure that Israel upholds its part of the deal. And again, just because you might see a ceasefire being agreed upon tonight or tomorrow, whenever it's agreed upon, if it's agreed upon, doesn't mean that Israel isn't going to continue hostilities. Just like there's a ceasefire in Gaza last year, and Israel has still been engaged in hostilities there, albeit at a lower level. But this doesn't mean that talks are going to be suspended and we're going to see the resumption of large-scale hostilities, unless Iran makes a move, which every indication is that they probably won't. So Israel's security cabinet there will be convening at 8 p.m. tonight to discuss the expected ceasefire. as well as Iran. And this is according to Israeli officials reporting to Reuters. According to the Iranian source, the temporary halt in hostilities is expected to last until the end of the ceasefire between Iran and the U.S. The truce is reportedly the result of Iranian demands in the talks. And so you can look back last week when the ceasefire first started, that this was one of the biggest points of contention between Iran and the U.S. It was that Israel continued in their war against Lebanon. And now we're seeing that Israel, at least as far as we can see, are having discussions about a ceasefire in Iran. And this is almost, if you want to interpret it in that way, an olive branch to Iran, saying, okay, yeah, we did agree with it. I happen to believe the U.S. did agree that Lebanon will be part of the ceasefire. We agreed to it. We want to keep you at the table. So this is what we're doing. In a way, that's kind of a cave on the Israeli side, but it seems that they are getting some pressure from Washington on this. And that would indicate that Washington wants to keep Iran at the table. Now, does that mean that the U.S. is going to negotiate in good faith? It's very unlikely. I wouldn't, if I were Iran, and I don't think it was a good idea for them to get into this ceasefire, honestly, in the first place, because of the amount of distrust that the U.S. negotiating side has instilled over the course of the past year since this stuff has popped off. But we'll have to see what they're actually presented with, and if they come down from some of their maximalist demands. I'm talking about the U.S. It doesn't appear that Iran is going to stick with the idea of the U.S. paying reparations, like we mentioned earlier. If they want sanctions, they do want sanctions relief, and it's likely that that will happen incrementally, and that may be something that the U.S. will work with. Unfrozen assets, sending money back to Iran the way that Obama did, it's very unlikely given the kind of pressure that Trump is getting from the Israelis. The nuclear program, that could go either way. But ultimately, we're going to see the talks continuing. And as I mentioned before, hostilities resuming after the talks in an election year, as Vance right now is doing the circuit. He just did a discussion at Turning Point where he was heckled mercilessly. And this was in preparation for midterms. And so the cycle has started. Summer is right around the corner. We're about halfway through the year. And I said it before, I strongly doubt that Trump wants to be dealing with this when midterms are going on. Now, I don't think that Trump cares too much about what happens to the Republican Party, as mentioned before. But I also don't think he wants to throw them so far under the bus that he loses both houses of Congress and gets impeached. He does want to stay in power, even if he doesn't have the House, because if he has the Senate still, then they can impeach him, but not necessarily remove him. You wouldn't have the votes in the Senate to do it. But those are the most recent developments right now, and I'm sure that when we talk again, we'll be talking about the following round of negotiations that will take place. And we'll meet back then. Thanks for joining me, and if you enjoyed the video, like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.